It's actually hard to find biblical scholars with whom to compare John Goldingay. It's also difficult to sort out the kinds of adjectives you might use to describe John Goldingay, in large part because we live in an age of specialization, and yet here is a scholar who has the grasp of biblical studies, Old and New Testament, and the theology that surrounds them. Here's a biblical scholar whose profound level of scholarship is forever in the service of the church. Here's a biblical scholar who never forgets that the chief aim of good biblical scholarship is proclamation, the incarnation of the Word in people's lives. In fact, one of the most impressive parts of John Goldingay's scholarship is his non-apologetic, non-defensive approach to reading Scripture as a believer firmly embedded in the church. Having worked with him these several years, having stood with him shoulder to shoulder, what I can tell you is that he is as advertised.
I was at the top end of high school. It was a year before I was going to be going to university. I was needing to have some clue, ideally, about what I was going to do with my life. For some reason, I was out one afternoon on my own, and it started raining. Remember, I come from England, and I sheltered in a doorway. When I walked into that doorway, I didn't know what I was going to do with my life, and when the rain stopped, I came out of the doorway knowing that I should train for the ministry. The point about Yahweh's speech, as I understand it, is in effect to say to Job, the world is much bigger than you, and you mustn't think that the world revolves around you. Now that's weird, isn't it? Because I know the world revolves around me, and don't you know that the world revolves around you? I mean, goodness, come on. The fact that I'm a pastor first and a professor second has a big influence on the way I go about being a professor, as well as probably on the way I go about being a pastor. Near the end of my teenage years, I sensed the Lord calling me to the ministry, which I assumed meant church ministry, parish ministry, and that I would do that all my life. And so I went to university and I went to seminary, and I did work in parish ministry for a short time. And then I drifted into being in seminary for 40 odd years. And now towards the end of my ministry, I find myself in charge of a church, which is where it looked as if I was going when I was in my late teens up to mid-20s, but didn't get there. So the shape of my life then has been preparation, if you like, through childhood and teenage years, and then that arc which has ministry in a church at the beginning and the end, and that long involvement in theological study and teaching and writing, occupying the bulk of the middle. The biggest challenges really have arisen out of the fact that my first wife, Anne, had multiple sclerosis. She had that diagnosed before we got married, so we lived with it for more than 40 years. And over the years she got more and more disabled, so that when we came to California, she was totally wheelchair bound. And obviously all the way through in different ways that brought different sorts of challenges for me. I couldn't ignore the questions raised by Anne's illness and what it meant for me when I was doing my academic work. I realised that when my wife was very sick, that people were more sorry for me than I was for myself. But I was really sorry for Anne. I grieved for Anne. But I didn't really grieve for me. Other people grieved for me. And there was a kind of proper piece of dynamic about that when it's your thing to deal with, you have to deal with it. When it's somebody who you love who goes through that, in other words, for me it was Anne, and for other people it was people who loved me. And you are helpless. And in her own way, then, Mrs. Job's suffering is at least as bad as Job's. And when she says, "Do you still persist in your integrity? Curse God and die." Is that her heart breaking? Is that rather than a sign of her unrighteousness? Anne died nearly 5 years ago. I remember somebody had said to me that they thought that my grieving would be easier than many people's because I'd done so much grieving over the years. It didn't feel that way. It felt as if I missed her and grieved over the loss of her just as much as anybody else would grieve over the loss of their spouse. And so I went through a period of maybe a year in which I got used to being without her and being on my own. I remember taking my bike to Santa Monica and riding up and down the boardwalk and then lying in the sand and thinking, I can do this being on my own. And it was really good that I'd reached that point before I met Kathleen. That was in the early summer of nearly 4 years ago. Kathleen showed up at a class that I taught, and I saw this woman in the front row and thought, oh, she's rather nice, isn't she? So I made a point of not talking to her, so that if she was in the room at the moment, she would say what a jerk she thought I was, because I totally ignored her and wouldn't respond to her questions and things like that. Eventually we had to have a meeting to talk about papers and things like that, and I discovered that not only was she attractive, she was also intelligent and interesting. And so in due course I asked her for a date. We had coffee on a Friday, we had our first date on the Saturday, we said I love you on the Sunday, and on the Monday we fixed the wedding date. Oh, and by the way, that was all after the class was finished and the grading was done.
To look at John, you'd never understand what a serious biblical scholar he was. He comes at you looking quite unlike a biblical scholar.
And where do you think he gets those socks?
I have no clue. Is it British? I don't have a clue. Yeah, I've never seen anything like it.
So then we had to go back to the clothing store because Kathleen had seen the socks.
I said, I know you want to see these socks. And I was right. So
it was a very expensive
happy
day,
ending. It was a very happy ending to the story.
A student once said that he'd been given the impression that the Old Testament was a collection of dusty old stories. It was really important that they happened, but they'd got no significance for us. And I want people to come to appreciate that these are real events that happen to people, and that they happen to people who are actually not so different from us. And if at the end of a quarter they've had their eyes opened to the fantastic significance of the Old Testament for us, then my job's done.
Then sings my soul, my Saviour God, to thee. How great thou art, how great thou art. Then sings my soul, my Saviour God.